When you came in this morning, a part of your handout was a nomination sheet. And this is really important that you give some thought and prayer to suggesting some people in our church to take on leadership roles for the leadership teams for 2022. There's some information there describing what the needs are. And if you have an opportunity this morning to fill that in a little bit, jot down a name or two, tear that off, and you can leave it on the table in the foyer when you leave. There's also the opportunity to do this online through the e-news and some of the links that are provided there. So please do that. Next Sunday is going to be a fabulous Sunday here at First Christian Church. It's been long awaited to have a candidate for our senior minister come and speak to us, and for us to have a congregational meeting after that to be able to affirm the unanimous recommendation of our search committee and the board of First Christian Church. A couple of housekeeping things about that. Because of confidentiality reasons, we're not going to stream the service next week on YouTube Live like we're doing now and like we do each Sunday. However, we will have streaming into the monitors in the gym for those that want to come and be able to spread out for social distancing. And that same streaming feed will be on a Zoom call by invitation, by registration only. There's been information provided, the e-news and letter as well about that. If you didn't get that, you can reach out to Gina at the church office. It'll be registration only, so only those that have registered in advance and are part of our congregation will be allowed to participate in that Zoom call. Gina's going to manage that with her computer and share her screen on that Zoom call. So everybody will be able to participate from long distance if they're not able to be here that Sunday. We're doing everything we can to make the worship service as accessible as possible while protecting confidentiality. So be prayerful about next week. Be thinking about what you can do to participate and encourage others to be here physically present for that week. It's very important that we have a great turnout next week for the congregation as the candidate comes to present the sermon time in the worship service next week. Your life is shaped by decisions you make. You are where you are and who you are largely because of the choices that you've made throughout your life. We've been looking at 3 questions for making better decisions. In a moment, I'll mention the third question, but in that question is one that's going to be helpful for those decisions that come at us by surprise at times. You know, if you're trying to decide even where to go to college for one of your youth or one of your grandkids or something to make that choice, you have time. It's not a pressured surprise choice. Perhaps it's a vacation you're planning. There's no surprise there. You're just working through the process. But those surprise decisions hit us at times. Maybe it was a time when someone gave you a job offer and gave you 1 week to make a choice and a decision. Or perhaps someone with whom you're in a relationship came to you and told you something totally unexpected. And suddenly you're faced with a life choice and a life decision, and the clock is ticking. The worst thing about surprise decisions, we never have time to get the information we need to make a good decision. Before I tell you question number 3, let's do a quick review. The first question, as you may recall, a few weeks ago was a really important one. In fact, I mentioned that it's probably the most important question of any that we'll ask. And it's the most important question because it sort of underpins the others. This was a question. Am I being honest with myself, really? We discussed bad choices that we've made, bad relationship decisions, perhaps bad financial choices and decisions. And that many of those happen at times because we're not really being honest with ourselves. And that those choices that we make, that sometimes is influenced because we're great salesmen to ourselves. If I want it this way or that way, then I can certainly sell myself and convince myself that this is the right choice. So that was that first question. The second question was, what story do I want to tell? Every decision that we make, decision by decision, weaves a story. The choices aren't made in isolation, and even though in the moment of the decision we're thinking about that moment and that time, and often not looking at the big picture and the broad story of our lives, every decision we make, decision by decision, becomes a permanent part of our lives. Here's question number 3. Is there a tension that deserves my attention? Sometimes when we're faced with a choice, we have options that we're looking at, there's a little bit of tension that comes in our gut and in our heart, and we're sort of feeling a little tension. There's a moment of pause. Perhaps there's a hesitation, and we're a little uncomfortable about making a choice. Those are what are called red flag moments. Those moments to pause and pay attention to. We're to pay attention to the tension. Pay attention to what bothers me. And in fact, it's helpful even to let what bothers you bother you more. Because science tells us that those red flag moments are the brain alerting us to pay attention, to be thoughtful, to be deliberate. Because when we pause, we stand a better chance of making better decisions. Another version of this takes shape when someone comes along and points out something you hadn't thought of before about that choice. Suddenly, where there was no tension, now there is tension because you're being second guessed. It feels like someone is questioning your judgment because they are. The problem and the challenge then is that creates relational tension as well. And when that comes at us, we are very skilled at dodging the truth by discounting the truth teller. Well, he just doesn't understand my circumstances. If I had his life, I wouldn't have a problem with this either, but that's not the life I have. Or she doesn't understand what it's like to be in my circumstance with my children and what I'm dealing with, and they just don't understand. So we discount the truth teller. We can find ourselves often aware of the tension, but discounting it because we are good at selling ourselves on what we want to do and what we want to believe. Here's the point. If there's any hesitation, pause and allow the tension to rise before you decide. There's a fascinating illustration in the Old Testament. The story involves David, who's Israel's second king. Now, David steps onto the pages of history as a shepherd boy. He and his family are at the house one afternoon, and a man named Samuel, who was a prophet, shows up. And he announces to the family, your son David is going to be Israel's next king. Now, they've just been out shepherding because that's what they do. And imagine this, out of all the people in all the world, in all of their world, Samuel is there on their doorstep saying, David is going to be Israel's next king. Now, that's a pretty good day. The problem is, Israel already had a king, King Saul. Well, Saul wasn't doing such a great job, so much to the fact that God had decided to make a dynasty change. So he sends Samuel to the house of Jesse, and Samuel anoints David as the next king of Israel. Now, David grows up and becomes a soldier and a leader, a very popular leader. He was very popular among the people, and Saul becomes jealous. So jealous that he tries to kill David. So David flees the city. Now, by that time, David was a folk hero because of that incident with Goliath. You remember that one? When David flees, hundreds flock to his side. Now, this is a small army. They were without a home. Many of the people in the army were made up of men who were on the run from the law. That's where we'll pick up the story as told by the prophet Samuel. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Saul needed to go to the bathroom. Now, we'll leave the story there for a minute and kind of come back to that in a moment. Today, you can drive through En-Gedi, and you'll find literally thousands of hillsides with thousands of caves. So think of the 3,000 men there in the valley, and Saul stops the entourage and needs to go to the bathroom. Let's go back to the story. Saul had marched out with these men. They're looking for David, and the kings apparently need to have privacy for this event. The story takes an interesting turn here because Saul wanders into this cave, and lo and behold, David and his men were far back in the cave. What are the odds? The thousands of hillsides and the thousands of caves. David and his men had scattered and hidden because Saul's men were coming through, and they were going to regroup and head the other direction after Saul's entourage passes. But there they are. Saul has stopped the caravan. He wanders into the cave, and David and his men's eyes were accustomed to the dark, so they could see the silhouette of Saul come in to the cave. You could probably hear the gasp when they looked up and saw this. And then the men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of, when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." Your enemy is literally within arm's reach. Imagine how that would play out. There's no need to pray or pause or anything because God has already told you he's going to deliver your enemy into your hands. Let's just take care of this. It doesn't get any better than this. The men thinking we're out here in hiding and this can be the end of it. We can take Saul out. David becomes king and we get to go home and we're no longer at risk from these 3,000 soldiers. The world can change in an instant. Imagine the emotion and the adrenaline. But apparently David felt a little hesitation. Something wasn't quite right, but he wasn't sure, and he decided really to press on through. Scripture tells us, then David crept up unnoticed. As he gets closer, the tension inside of him begins to build, and he pauses and pays attention. And he paused long enough because somewhere between leaving the back of the cave and the hiding place to being able to literally reach out and touch Saul, he gains clarity. I'm about to murder the king. This can't be right. Who put Saul on the throne? God put Saul on the throne. How smart is it to replace what God has put in place? So in spite of expectations, David changes course. Now, we all have something in common. David didn't know the outcome. We all, in our moments of decision making, think we do. And he thought he did, but he really knew there was no guarantee that if he killed Saul, that he would actually become king right then. One reason we ignore tension at times and don't pause is because we think we can predict the outcome. We don't always predict them well and accurately because sometimes we're disappointed. What is disappointment? It's always connected to an unexpected outcome. When we make a decision assuming a particular outcome and the outcome doesn't materialize, we experience disappointment. Here's my point. Ignoring the tension in your gut sets you up for disappointment. Paying attention to the tension is how you avoid unnecessary disappointment. Let's go back to David. So David creeps up behind him. The text tells us that he's conscience stricken. There's something inside of him that he wants to control what's going to happen now. And he does something that most of us don't have the control to do. He changes course, as I mentioned. And instead of murdering Saul, he creeps up behind him and takes part of the robe that Saul had discarded and cuts a piece of it. And he goes back to hiding. Now the men are in shock. Here's the opportunity. They saw themselves going home. In their mind, they were playing forward everything that could happen now that they were going to kill Saul. And David comes back to them. And he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed." In other words, who am I to replace what God has put in place? Or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed for the Lord. With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave. and went his way. Saul leaves the cave having no clue how close he was to joining his dead ancestors. Saul rejoins his men. Suddenly he hears a voice. He and the 3,000 men look up to the hillside, and there, standing in the mouth of the cave that Saul had just exited, is David yelling out. And he calls out to Saul. And those 3,000 men hear the voice of David, the man they were hunting. David bows down to the king and then stands and holds up a piece of Saul's garment. He could have killed Saul and chose not to. He spared Saul's life, knowing that Saul would have killed him in the same circumstance. Well, he then makes a powerful statement. May the Lord judge between you and me. In other words, Saul, I'm not going to do the wrong thing. I'm going to do the right thing. God made you king. I will not play God in your life or mine. He goes on. May the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. I will not use your bad behavior as an excuse to do bad things. May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. Now here's the thing. Paying attention to that seemingly irrational tension is important for everyone who believes in a personal relationship with the living God. Because it's in those moments that sometimes God redirects us and directs us to a different choice, to a different decision than the one that we were selling ourselves. That red flag is God's way of saying there's a different direction. People whose lives who are wholly yielded to God don't have to play God and predict outcomes. So, pay attention to the tension. If you don't, you may end up on the other side of a decision you wish you could go back and unmake. That was certainly the case with Saul. Humiliated by David, not by David's military prowess, but by David's humility itself. So what do you do if you're Saul? Well, he packed up and turned his army around. Then something interesting happens. Not too long after this humiliating event, Saul and his army are engaged in a battle with the Philistines. And a random arrow from behind the Philistine infantry falls randomly among the Israelite army. And this random archer's random arrow found a seam in Saul's armor, severely wounding him. Now Saul doesn't want to die at the hands of his enemies, so he falls on his own sword. When the word reached the people, they immediately proclaimed David king. David becomes king without having to murder Saul. Now perhaps David thought, if somebody had just told me, it would have been so much easier in that moment. So much easier if I had only known the outcome was going to happen this way. Well, we know that's not how life works. It's tough. That's why we have to pay attention to the tension. That's why we dare not trust our ability to predict the future. That's why you must ask yourself every time you're making a decision, is there a tension that deserves my attention? Michelle was a 16-year-old girl in the youth group in our church. One week she asked for a meeting with me, and she came into my office and tells me through tears that she's pregnant. She and her boyfriend had been having a sexually active relationship, and she had found herself pregnant and was distraught, didn't know what to do. She was considering abortion, didn't know if she could keep the baby. She just didn't know what she was going to do, let alone she was frightened of what her parents would say when she told them the truth. Because her parents were prominent members of the church. Her father, in fact, was chairman of the deacons, a very outspoken person about his beliefs against premarital sex and his beliefs against abortion, and just very rigid in some of his ways that he presented his own beliefs. And she knew that and knew that this would be horribly embarrassing to the family. She had a few weeks to make her decision. So over time I spent with her, she came to a place of telling her parents that she wanted to keep the baby. Interestingly, the father even brought up the possibility of abortion. Because sometimes when it happens to you, it's different than just stating a principle. But they eventually embraced her choice, and about a year later, we celebrated Michelle and her son at baby dedication. Michelle paid attention to the tension. She was willing to pause and listen for God's direction and the direction of a choice that she could make. Didn't try to sell herself on a quick answer. She was willing to pay the price, to listen and be open, and to pay attention. The question is, will you? Amen.